Welcome, everyone. We will get started in just a few moments. Welcome, welcome. Thank you all for joining us today. Today's presentation is Heat Without Fire, using the power of the earth to heat and cool with home geothermal. Archaeologists trace human use of geothermal energy back to the earliest evolution of our species, when living in caves allowed us to take advantage of the relatively constant temperature of the earth to create comfortable homes. Today, geothermal technology for home heating and cooling is undergoing a bit of a renaissance as beneficial electrification has become the most viable path to transition our buildings off of fossil fuels. Heather Deese is with us today. She is the Director of Policy and Regulatory Affairs at Dandelion Energy. And she'll talk a little bit about how geothermal systems heat and cool buildings without any combustion of fossil fuels, and about some recent innovations that are making geothermal a viable, affordable solution for building electrification. Thanks for joining us, Heather. My name is Kathleen Meal. I am Director of Policy and Partnerships at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 10,000 members and supporters dedicated to protecting Maine's environment and our democracy. MCA does that through education, collaboration, and advocacy, and MCV by influencing public policy, holding politicians accountable, and winning elections. A few technical notes for today. We will hear from Heather first and then tackle questions in the Q&A session at the end. You don't have to wait though. You can send questions to me through the chat whenever they occur to you, and I'll keep track of them to ask during the Q&A at the end. If you have any technical difficulties today, you can message Will Sedlak and he will help you out. This event is being recorded and the video will be posted on our website later this afternoon, where you can also find recordings of all of our previous programs. Thanks again for joining us. And Heather, I will turn it over to you to get things started.
Great, thank you. I'm so pleased to be here today. Just gonna share my screen. Give me a moment here to get oriented. Hopefully you all are seeing this now. And Will or Kathleen, can you guys still admit people even though I'm seeing them pop up? Okay. Great.
We sure can.
All right, the presentation.
And Heather, can I just quickly, we've had a couple questions for closed captioning. We are trying to turn on the closed captioning system, and it is being a little difficult this cold wintry morning. Closed captions will be available on the YouTube recording afterwards, and we apologize, and we'll make sure this works for next week's program.
Great.
Back to you, Heather.
Okay, thanks. You guys are seeing this opening slide, okay? All right. Excellent. Well, thank you again for having me. My name is Heather Deese. I work for this company, Dandelion, and I'm looking forward to talking about geothermal for home heating and cooling today. I am a very big supporter and fan of Maine Conservation Voters, and I live in Camden, Maine. So I've been in Maine for about 20 years and have been raising my kids here and have worked in a number of different roles with different organizations in Maine. And just recently, in the past 6 months, took this job with Dandelion, which is not in Maine yet as a company operating in different areas, but I'm hoping will be someday very soon. So as context, one of the pieces that feels most important to me about why I think geothermal is important is because of the ways in which we are currently using fossil fuels in our homes are not only terrible for our environment and very expensive in lots of cases, but also we have combustion going on in our homes, and that creates a lot of health issues and frankly dangers. the fact that I have carbon monoxide detectors throughout my home because I could be poisoned in the middle of the night, or my family could be poisoned in the middle of the night due to my heating system, is just something that makes me, fundamentally uncomfortable. And I am very happy to be part of a company that is trying to change that and just remove combustion from having to happen inside our homes. And there are now more studies coming out and more news reports coming out, which is why I really like this piece that came out on NPR this fall, which was sort of, I think, the first time I had heard in kind of mass media as opposed to energy dork media about the issues that happen in people's health from having natural gas in their homes, and the issues around allergies and asthma being so much worse for people who grew up with gas cooking stoves in their home. So this is a piece that is very important to me, and I just wanted to point out as something that I think people are starting to be more aware of, but is an important piece of kind of thinking about the future we could make happen and have cleaner, fresher air inside our homes. So in terms of the bigger picture of climate and clean energy and why geothermal is important today, greenhouse gas emissions with carbon dioxide as a big piece of that are, one of the, I think, biggest issues that we're facing as a society. And on the left, we have the US greenhouse gas emissions. On the right is Maine's carbon dioxide emissions. I'm sure there is a good chart somewhere that shows all greenhouse gas emissions for Maine, but I couldn't find it. So I have carbon dioxide emissions here. And in Maine, transportation is the biggest carbon dioxide contributor, but the residential sector is a second, and buildings have most of their emissions coming from heating and cooling. We also, of course, have water heating and cooking, but heating and cooling is the largest component of home emissions. And fossil fuels currently dominate how we heat our homes in the US. So more than 60% of homes are burning some type of fossil fuel. 40% across the US are electricity or no heat, but that electricity is usually now kind of an older, more expensive, less efficient form of electric heat, the electric resistance heat that people put in over past decades. And so the transition that people are talking about now is moving to heat pumps. So both air source heat pumps and ground source or geothermal heat pumps as the clean new way to go electric for heating and cooling. And this is a regional look that I think is really interesting. I did not know how much, natural gas and electric and propane are actually sort of spread out throughout the country, but heating oil is really predominantly a Northeast US issue in terms of where it is that we actually still use sort of the dirtiest of the fossil fuels in our home. And if you look at New England, it's 2 million households currently on heating oil. And if you add New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, that's another 2.6 million homes. So it's just a tremendous number of households that are still using delivered heating oil to heat with. This is just another sort of look at that. New York, Connecticut, and Massachusetts are highlighted in this just because that's where Dandelion Energy as a company is currently operating. But just to point out that the fuel oil is an issue in multiple ways. It's very expensive. The fuel delivery process itself is dangerous. And there's just a lot of safety issues that come from having giant trucks full of flammable liquid that are driving around on our roads. And so looking at alternatives that can get us off of fuel oil and propane are major priorities. In Maine, we have more than 500,000 households, and the vast majority of those are heated with heating oil. We also have propane, wood, a very small number of utility gas customers relative to most other states. And that is because we're so rural that we haven't built out a gas system the way that most of the US in more urban areas has, or more densely populated areas. It was interesting to see that there's 800 or so homes that, at least according to the US Census data, are heated completely with solar thermal, which is cool. I don't know if that's accurate, but that's US Census data. One of the pieces that is really exciting working in clean energy field now is the number of different institutions, research groups, university groups that are actually putting together viable plans for how we as a country can transition to being a net zero carbon emission economy. And so this is just one example. It came out of the Berkeley labs, and it is looking at sort of a set of different actions by 2030 that then, amped between 2030 and 2050 could get us to carbon neutral as a society. And on the right, the top piece that has space heat has this really nice growing curve, the blue color on the bottom of the number of heat pumps. So by this analysis, they're estimating that we need about 150 million space heating systems by the year 2050, and about 120 million of those will be heat pumps. So Maine is also part of this effort. Maine's Climate Council issued its report a bit over a year ago. Kathleen Neal actually was co-chair of the committee that focused on buildings and the built environment, and they had their set of strategies and recommendations in the Climate Council's report for energy efficient, smart, and cost-effective homes. And one of their recommendations was to transition to cleaner heating and cooling systems with a focus on heat pumps. So there is a piece of policy in Maine now that is focused on 100,000 air source heat pumps being deployed across the state. We have not had a major focus on geothermal heat pumps, and I have not heard much focus on whole home heat pump systems in terms of the policies that are actually going to get us there. But there is now this goal that is articulated in the Climate Council report to have 115,000 homes that have whole home heat pump systems. So what is geothermal heating and cooling, and how is it the same or different than air source heat pumps? So a heat pump is just a machine that uses electricity to move heat from one place to another. And air source heat pumps, which many of us are familiar with, I certainly am. I have 3 of them in my home. I'm always looking up at the unit here when I'm talking to people about it. Air source heat pumps are taking heat from the air outside your home and bringing it inside your home during the winter, or taking the heat from inside your home and putting it outside your home during the summer to cool. And so a geothermal heat pump is doing the same thing, except using the ground as the source of heat or the sink of heat. So this figure, which comes from Clean Technica, is showing on the left during your cooling season, when you want air conditioning in your home, that you're taking the heat from your home and you're sending it back down and dispersing it into the ground. And during the heating season on the right, I like that little snowman, you are taking heat from the ground and essentially running it through the heat pump and into your home. So geothermal heat pumps come in lots of different flavors. You can have, it's always a system that involves water with a little bit of glycol just for antifreeze purposes. And so you don't have anything, growing in the water, but it's a closed loop system for most geothermal. You can have open loop system that uses like a water well and is just taking heat from an open well. But for our company, and most companies install closed loop systems, so you're installing plastic piping in the ground, and then you have a trench that's running horizontally from your vertical borehole into the home. And if it's a home with a basement, those lines go directly in underground. So there's no above ground piece of the system, very similar to your water wells that most of us in Maine have who aren't on a city system for water. And then the fluid from that closed loop borehole is coming into the home, into the heat pump, and then the heat pump is transitioning that either into a forced water system, if you have radiators or radiant floor heating or something like that, or into a forced air system. Dandelion, the company I work with, does forced air systems. And part of the reason for that is so that you can get both central air conditioning and heating from the system. Whereas if it's a water to water system and you're using radiators, then you don't get that air conditioning benefit. There's another type of system, which we're also starting to install now, where instead of using ductwork to send the air throughout the home, you actually have a multi-split unit. So the heat pump in the basement or in a utility closet then connects to multiple heads in individual rooms. So that's similar to a multi-split air source heat pump system. Okay, so why geothermal is so helpful? So one of the reasons is because the cost of operating is lower than any other form of heating. So the US EPA has analyzed all of the different types of heating systems in the US and identified geothermal as the one that has the best environmental footprint and the lowest cost for customers of operation. So the issue with geothermal is the upfront cost of install, but once that loop is in the ground, either a horizontal loop or a vertical loop, like the one that I showed in the last image, then that system works for you. The loop lifetime is usually between 50 and 100 years. So it's like putting a metal roof on your home, and that it's there for a very long time. And then you just are paying for heat pumps that are then taking advantage of that loop. And so the ongoing operating costs are just for the electricity primarily to move that heat around and run the heat pump. It also has a huge beneficial environmental impact. So these examples are for the 5-ton water to air systems that Dandelion puts in. The reduction emissions for a home that's coming off of fuel oil is 80%, which is pretty amazing. And that's assuming the mix of power on the grid in the places where we're operating. So that grid energy is not completely clean. The reduction in carbon dioxide over the lifetime is pretty amazing. It's the equivalent to taking 40 cars off of the road, or 39 cars. Ground source heat pumps are also really important in terms of thinking about the electrify everything that is now really in a very exciting way part of more and more conversations. If we got to where we can electrify transportation with electric vehicles, and we can electrify our buildings, heating and cooling and hot water heating with heat pumps, then we are going to have a lot less combustion that we ourselves are doing in our cars and in our homes, but a huge reliance on the grid. And so the electric grid is going to need to be up to the task of moving a lot more electricity around, and we need to have a lot more generation. One of the benefits of ground source heat pumps relative to air source heat pumps is that they do use a lot less electricity. And that's because the ground is much easier to draw heat from in the middle of the winter because it stays warmer underground, and much easier to dump heat into during the summer because, again, it stays cooler underground in the summer. So whereas an air source heat pump this time of year, on a day like today in Maine, my air source heat pumps are working really, really hard, and they're not quite keeping up with keeping it warm in my house. I have to have my wood stove going all day today, and have had for the last few weeks. And ground source heat pumps don't need that backup, so they can take over the entire system. We remove fossil fuel systems from homes, and they are increasing the load on the grid, especially during peak demand, by much, much less than if you are transitioning to all air source heat pumps. So Dandelion, the company I work for, is, after 3 years of operation, as we understand it, we're the largest residential geothermal installer in the United States. We are currently active in New York, Connecticut, and Massachusetts, and one county of Vermont. We have a cool origin story in that our founder, Kathy Hanoun, is a woman, which is unusual in the clean energy tech space. She worked at what at the time was called Google X, now Alphabet X Innovation Lab. And she was exploring moonshot ideas for climate. And their job was to spend, 6 months on each project trying to poke holes in it, trying to find problems with the idea, why it wouldn't work. And somebody suggested residential geothermal to her team, and they spent 6 months trying to figure out why it wouldn't work, and they couldn't figure out why it wouldn't work. So she decided to quit her job there and create a company to try to deliver residential geothermal in an affordable way, and widespread to every homeowner for whom it could be a benefit. So it's a company, it's up to 180 employees now. As I mentioned, I joined about 6 months ago as the first person to do policy and regulatory affairs for the company. So ground source heat pumps have been around in basically their modern form for a long time. It's not a new technology, but up until I would say Dandelion, it had been a technology that was sort of a boutique very specialized kind of one-off. For residents, it meant that if you wanted to get geothermal for your home, it's going to be an expensive proposition, and that you need to have a big piece of property in order to get a big rig on there to drill a hole. And, it's even going to be hard to find someone who will do it for you in a lot of cases. Commercial geothermal is much more prevalent. We have schools and commercial buildings all over the state of Maine on geothermal. And that's true over, many parts of the country where it makes sense in terms of heating and cooling load. And the reason for that, again, is just the size of the equipment, the cost in sort of getting rigs moved around. It just hadn't been done to bring it to a residential scale at a cost that works for people. So the goal of Dandelion is to make geothermal affordable and accessible widely to sort of regular homeowners throughout the US. So we've done that by investing in drill rigs that can operate in very small spaces. There's an example here of them drilling in the side yard of a home in the suburbs. We have a software-driven design process that allows us to be using proprietary data that we pay for that gives us more information on the subsurface, on the stratigraphy, on the rocks, on the amount of water underground, so that we're able to design the loop size to exactly what's needed for each home, which means we're able to do drilled holes that are shorter, smaller than otherwise people had done. And that makes a big difference on cost. And then we are also really focused on customers and on making sure that we can provide our customers with a sort of complete soup to nuts system. We do the drilling, we do the trenching to the home, we do the HVAC install. In some cases, that's all Dandelion crews. In some cases, we're working with subcontractors for different pieces of that process. But we then are there with the customer for operations and maintenance of their system for the long term. And in many cases, we're bringing financing to the customer as well. And that allows people to be able to afford it on an ongoing basis, paying similar or less than what they have been paying for their fuel. So this is just a little bit more detail about the rigs, the software that I just talked about, allowing us to get the drill hole to exactly the right size. And we also are working on developing different heat pump equipment. We have an R&D project to actually develop a heat pump that will be optimized for heating. All of the heat pumps in the market today are actually optimized for cooling. And so we are in the middle of trying to build one that will work better in the Northeast US and other cold parts of the US. I think I probably covered this. And just to make the point that for customers who are coming off of heating oil or propane, they usually have a simple payback period of 5 to 7 years for the system. If they finance it on a 10 or 12-year term, then they're usually seeing basically the same expense that they've been seeing, paying for their fuel oil and air conditioning costs. And now those are going away. Instead, they're paying the electricity on an ongoing basis for the heat pump. So they will see their electricity increase, but we can still take those savings that they're seeing from the fuel that they're not paying for and apply that to their loan for the geo installation. And then at the end of that loan, then their costs are much, much lower. This example is actually showing a gas customer. So if this was a heating oil customer, the savings over 20 years are usually more like $60,000 to $80,000. But for a gas customer, it's a lower savings because gas is so much cheaper right now. We also have developed a process that allows us to work with the homeowner so that the homeowner takes pictures of the inside of their home, of their heating system, of their outside of their home, and they send those photos to us, and then we use software to actually create a modeled home, and we do the whole design process and get to the point of being ready to sign a contract with the customer without ever having someone from our team have to go to the home, and that saves on the process and timing up front too. And we do see wonderful opportunity. My job with Dandelion was created to do the work with state governments and utilities around the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic, and now also the Upper Midwest and the Mountain West to look at expanding, as well as I also do a lot of work at the federal level on initiatives like the Build Back Better bill, which I'm still really hopeful we'll see at least the climate and energy pieces move now. So we are, really excited about geothermal. It is sort of trying to make a product be available widely. And there are lots of different companies that are manufacturing heat pumps. This is some example of the different types. They come in all different sort of formulations that mean that different homes that have different existing systems can plug into them. And really it's about, how can we get to volume and therefore bring the cost down so that more and more people will be able to access these systems. And importantly, the public support that helps make that initial investment more reasonable for people. And that's been where the incentives for rebates from utilities have been really key. And so a big piece of the way that we can put together a value proposition for the cost for customer is not only the federal tax credit, but also the rebates that utilities or state programs have offered throughout the region. So we don't have great rebates in Maine yet. I think there's a bunch of different reasons for that, but there are really helpful rebates around other parts of the Northeast right now that in addition to the kind of free money of a rebate, there's also publicly subsidized financing for these projects, and that makes a really big difference too. So when we're working with customers, we have commercial bank loans that we can set up for them, but we also always will access the publicly available programs whenever we can, because often the interest rates are better there than we can get commercially because of public funds that are buying down those rates. So that's the overall story for geothermal and what I wanted to share with you today. I'm really excited to have this be a conversation and answer questions and hear from you all for the rest of the time today. And the call to action is just really to talk with people. I think geothermal is, at least in Maine and certainly throughout probably most of the country, geothermal might be in the same place that air source heat pumps were a couple of years ago, in that most people haven't heard of it, or they think it's maybe just a niche thing or something that only works for universities or airports or really rich people. But, we are really excited about having geothermal be available and accessible for everyone. And so I would love it if, as a call to action today, you all are, have a conversation with one person in your life and tell them that you heard about this cool thing. And that would be fantastic. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Heather. And I want to remind everybody that you'll get an email later this afternoon with both the link to this recording and a reminder about that call to action. Also, quickly found that article that you started off with, Heather, and we'll put a link in there too so everybody can read what you need to know about your gas stove, your health, and climate change. We have a ton of questions, so let's dive right in. And let's start with a question about beneficial electrification in general. What do folks need to know about the issues that come up when you switch from fossil fuels to an all-electric kind of system?
I have to say what we hear the most, and we've heard this from some of the home builders that we have partnered with. So, not as much in the Northeast, but some parts of the Northeast and certainly throughout a lot of the rest of the country, there's still a lot of new home building going on with developments of, 10 or 50 or 150 homes being built by developers and then sold to individuals. And what we've heard from developers on their concerns about building all electric new home neighborhoods is nothing about the heating and cooling. People are comfortable and confident once they learn about heat pumps, but the gas stove for cooking is the big issue. So having familiarity with induction cooktops actually is as much of an issue for us in geothermal as people having familiarity with geothermal, because in order to have fully electric new neighborhoods, then you have to have people be comfortable that they're not going to have a gas stove. And the kind of modern electric cooking is just as much of a leap forward as the modern electric heating. And that is definitely a big one. So I would say, in addition to talking with your friends and family about geothermal, ask whether anyone you know has an induction cooktop. If you have one, you know how great they are. Tell other people how great they are. I moved into a house last year that already had one, and I can make dinner in like 2/3 to half the time that I could on a gas stove because everything just cooks much more quickly. So I love it. And I love telling people about it now. But I do think that because when you are transitioning homes, ideally, you're really coming off all the fossil fuels. And certainly when you're building new neighborhoods, you do not want to put in gas lines. And so having people be comfortable with that new type of cooking is really important.
That's so interesting. Thank you. And definitely, like geothermal, there's a little bit of a learning curve on induction cooking, but lots of really good information out there. Thank you. All right. How do utilities feel about geothermal?
Well, it largely depends on whether they're an electric utility or a gas utility. So electric utilities tend to really like geothermal because it does, add some electric usage for a household. Gas utilities in general tend to not like geothermal. If it's a company that owns both gas and electric utility, which many of them do, then it depends which part of the company you're talking with in general. So that's been a pretty interesting piece for me of working with utilities on their rebate programs. I would say that many of the larger utilities, the gas utilities, are looking out at their future now and feeling like they are going to need different business models. And so we're in conversations with, I would say, 3 or 4 different utilities around the country that are interested in putting together their own district loop geo systems, where the utility would own the geo system, and then they'll charge customers a monthly heating and cooling service fee. And so customers might own the heat pump in their own home, just like currently customers own the furnace, but they pay for the gas to the utility. So in this model, if utilities build the geo loops, then the customers will pay the utility for that geo heating and cooling service.
That's great. And there were actually a couple of questions about district heating and neighborhoods going in together. And are there places that that's happening where you can share case studies, or is it still sort of an idea?
Yeah, so actually there's a super exciting set of projects in Massachusetts. There's a very, very cool group. It's a nonprofit called HEAT, H-E-E-T, and I definitely would encourage people to look that up, or Kathleen, you could include it when you send out notes. And they, I think it's Home Energy Efficiency Team is what HEAT stands for. And they started doing like weatherized neighborhood campaigns years ago. And I think they might've done some local solarized campaigns and stuff like that in Eastern Mass. And then they started looking at gas leaks and started mapping where gas leaks were happening in the utility gas system. And they got so concerned, especially after there was a gas explosion in Massachusetts a couple of years ago, that they started advocating for coming off of gas and working with the utilities. So that project is actually with, I believe it's National Grid in Massachusetts, where they are, maybe it's Eversource. Anyway, they are, the utility is actually issuing RFPs for district loop geo, which is sort of, everyone I've talked to is just so impressed and amazed that this largely volunteer effort at HEAT has managed to get this done. And there's a huge environmental justice component to this, and a focus on making sure that the workers who are employees of the gas companies, it could also then be the geo company and have a future workforce transition. And so they have a bunch of really cool aspects of it. So that's sort of the best one that I would point people to. There's also a development in, I believe, Austin, Texas area called Whisper Valley. And that is a private sector, developer effort to build new homes in a new neighborhood. So different than the retrofitting that HEAT is working on. And that's also a district system. So individual vertical boreholes for different homes, but all tied together. Part of the issue is that the efficiency of pumping the water around a system, you actually lose a lot. And so the most efficient systems, the most cost efficient and the most efficient in terms of the ongoing operating costs, are actually individual loops in each person's yard. Even if you had like a whole neighborhood who decided to go in on the expense of it together, it still will be the cheapest long-term operating cost for the electricity if you just have the right size loop for each building, rather than moving the kind of, water around between the buildings. So there's reasons why individual loops make the most sense. But if you have an entity like a municipality or utility that wants to build the whole thing and charge for it, then, that works well too.
That's fascinating. Okay, thank you. Lots of us have invested in air source heat pumps, but I heard you make some clear arguments for why ground source might be even better. Can we convert, or what's the story there?
Yeah, so and I am one of those proud owners of 3 relatively new air source heat pumps that I put in this summer. You can absolutely convert, and in fact, air source heat pumps also, people do whole home systems, mostly now where they have a combined dual fuel. So they have an air source heat pump that has a gas component of it so that it deals with the, coldest times of year and that sort of thing. So, you absolutely can switch out from one to the other. And if you have done the cassettes inside each room as part of ductless air source heat pumps, rather than a ducted central air source heat pump system. So most of us, I think in Maine, are putting in the ductless air source heat pumps with the 1 outdoor unit to the 1 unit in each room, or a multi-split with a couple of units from an outdoor. So you can potentially reconnect those heads to a central variable refrigerant flow geosystem. So you could do that and use the same heads that are already in the rooms.
All right, so we can, and we can also mix and match, right? There's a value there, or is it really, if you were going to invest in geothermal, would it make sense to use geothermal throughout the house? So many of us have like a mishmash of heating systems from room to room.
Yeah, actually, I mean, one of the things that I think is really complicated is trying to figure out for buildings where, for homes where people have done additions over time. And so maybe they've got one room that's got electric resistance, they've got part of the house on ducts, sometimes they even also have part of the house on radiators. So I know our design team is regularly dealing with how to be able to work with homes like that. And in some cases, we will put in the central sort of whole home geosystem, but then there'll be sort of one room where it really doesn't make sense. And so it makes sense to do an air source heat pump. So sometimes we're installing air source heat pumps as part of a system. I would say that, primarily the expense of drilling and getting that ground loop in the ground is high enough that if you can just switch the whole thing over and then not be paying for, anything else, then that is going to help make it a viable, value proposition.
That makes sense. And as far as that drilling goes, is it vertical? Is it horizontal? Say a little more about that, how the drilling actually works.
Yeah, so it can be either. So basically what you need is just to have this loop so that the water can, flow through enough ground that it will recover the temperature before it goes back into the home, if it's heating season. And so that loop can be a horizontal loop that's buried, below frost, between 4 feet and 6 feet down, or it can be the vertical loop. And the decision on that usually depends on the size of the property. Most people in the US don't have enough property to be able to do a horizontal loop. But I don't think that's true in Maine. I don't know the average lot size in Maine and how many people have a couple of acres, but for anybody who does have a couple of acres, a horizontal loop can fit, and even maybe, an acre and a half, probably a horizontal loop can fit. Again, it depends a little bit on the property itself, obviously, and setback rules, which are jurisdiction specific, but as long as you've got the space for it, a horizontal loop is cheaper. So for Dandelion, where we install horizontal loops for customers, in upstate New York or Western New York, where people do have more space, it's a cheaper system than the vertical drill, because it's just a backhoe, right? And so it's less expensive equipment. It's less, highly skilled, specialized people running the equipment. So the vertical wells are really the solution where you've got smaller lot sizes. And then the other thing that is worth mentioning is that if you have a pond on your property or a water body, you can also run the loop through that. And that can work really effectively as long as it's something that's deep enough that it doesn't totally freeze in the winter. And so people do set up geosystems using water too.
There must be just a set of questions that everybody asks because you're anticipating a lot of them. And there were a bunch about, is there such thing as a marine-based geothermal? And it sounds like the answer is yes.
Yes, and in fact, somebody told me the other day that I know I can't remember whether it was in Europe or in China, but that there's a municipal system that runs through the ocean. But now I can't remember where it was. So I'm still getting up to speed. I'm not like a long-term geo geek, but yeah, there's all kinds. I think there's also maybe in Toronto, one of the Canadian cities where it runs through a lake. So yeah, you definitely can use water bodies.
So that's when you're interacting with water bodies on purpose. What happens? Do we have to worry about interacting with water unintentionally? Do we have to worry about disrupting either wells or groundwater or even septic systems? There's a lot there. What do we have to avoid?
Right. So there are, as there should be, regulations around setback from other, pieces of infrastructure you've got on your own property, right? So for a lot of us in Maine, we have our own septic system, we have our own well. We've got regulations that mean that you can't put your drinking well right next to your leach field for very good reason. So there are also regulations about how close you can go for any kind of drilling in the yard, including geothermal. And in that instance, like how close you can be from a septic system or a water well, a lot of it has to do with just making sure that in the process of that vertical drilling that you're not gonna, where you're using forced air to do that drilling, that you're not gonna be blasting anything into your water well, right? I mean, a lot of us have probably had experiences where your well ends up like pretty muddy for a couple of days after some big rainstorm, like it opens up a vein underground and you end up with some silt in your well. So there are definitely concerns, and we want to make sure that we're far enough away. We have our own, company policies about how far away we'll be from a well, even with local jurisdictions that don't have rules, and many jurisdictions do have rules about how many feet away you need to be. But that's just for that sort of initial install. Once it's in the ground, it's really, it is plastic, unfortunately. Like I wish we were somehow making it not out of plastic, but it is inert plastic. The loops that we use are made of HDPE plastic, which is that same that like the white milk jugs, not the see-through milk jugs, but the white ones, those are the HDPE colored plastic. It's essentially that same plastic, but thicker. And once those pipes are in the ground, I guess if you had some kind of like major event in your yard where you had a washout and 4 feet of topsoil was removed, then you might see the top of that. But the whole thing, the loop ends 4 feet underground. So anything on the surface shouldn't cause issues. And then the heat pump in the basement or in your utility room, is a piece of electrical equipment that you do not want to have flood. And so you do need to make sure that, you're dealing with that just like you are with your furnace or anything else in the basement.
And any of us who have had to drill wells or replace septic systems know that the amount of ledge and really hard bedrock in Maine is a challenge. How do you navigate that?
Yeah, so actually, I was really surprised by this when I started working at Dandelion, but it turns out to be cheaper and easier for us to drill in places where the bedrock is very close to the surface than in places where there's a lot of overburden of different, soil or aggregate. And the reason for that is usually because there's less water that comes up in the drilling process. So there are parts of our current territory where the bedrock is really close to the surface, and that's actually easiest for us to drill through, where you have, kind of a lot of like messy aggregate and tends to be wetter, then you can sometimes just get kind of a real mess when you're dealing with the drilling and the what's coming out of the drill hole. So we are working on newer ways to make sure that everything is like neat and tidy, especially in small suburban environments where we're drilling, in terms of having everything that comes out of the hole like go into a holding container rather than sitting like in another part of the yard while it sorts itself out. Because we definitely, like you can imagine, in suburban neighborhoods, like people do not want to deal with a bunch of muddy silt that's coming out of their neighbor's, lawn and running down the road to the overflow drain. So we're in the process of developing like more and more approaches to dealing with that. But yeah, rock is actually the easiest.
Conventional wisdom is not always correct. I like it. Thank you. let's talk about where, so you've talked a little bit about the challenges in a smaller, more dense neighborhood, but let's talk about different kinds of housing. Can geothermal be used with manufactured homes, like mobile homes?
It absolutely can be. Again, I think it's a cost and investment issue. Often with manufactured homes, there's a difference in ownership between the property and the home. And so you run into some similar issues that you run into with any kind of electrifying or energy efficiency upgrades where you have a landlord and a renter. So often with manufactured housing, there's an owner who owns the property and there's some rent paid, and then the actual home is owned by the homeowner and the resident, but you still have that mismatch of kind of landlord and renter that you have with large apartment buildings, and where unless the landlord is paying for the heat, it's not necessarily in his or her interest to do energy efficiency upgrades. And so there's lots of different sort of public policy initiatives that are trying to deal with that breakdown. But besides that, absolutely, you can absolutely do that.
Thanks for giving a shout out to the Buildings, Infrastructure and Housing Working Group of the Maine Climate Council. I will own that we did not spend a lot of time talking about geothermal in Maine. And I won't ask you why, because that doesn't seem fair, but remind us, Dandelion is working in Maine or not? I mean, are home geothermal systems being installed in Maine, and at what rate right now?
Yeah, so I know part of the answer to that question, and the other part I don't know, but I would be really interested to learn. So unfortunately, from my perspective as a Mainer, Dandelion is not operating in Maine right now. So Dandelion is in New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and the southwest part of Vermont. We are very much interested in coming to New Hampshire, well, throughout the state of Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, and Rhode Island. And I think that there's a very high likelihood that that could happen in the next year or two. It depends on a couple of things. First of all, it's just constraints on how quickly we can grow. We've been opening up new warehouses every 3 to 6 months and hiring people as quickly as we can. And it's amazing how hard it is to hire people who are really skilled and have experience, and especially licenses in electrical, plumbing, HVAC, and drilling. So that is a big constraint on our growth. So we're sort of growing as quickly as we can hire for right now. We also have had, the ability to have the cost be reasonable for customers is based on having rebates that are, on par with what the greenhouse gas savings and energy efficiency savings are. And, the states in our current market have increased their geothermal rebates in recent years, recognizing the energy efficiency benefits and savings. And the fact that Dandelion is pushing to build a lot more systems. In the past, there just hasn't been a lot of pressure on policymakers because there hasn't been much of an industry. There are geo installs happening in Maine. Since I came to work for Dandelion, I've had multiple different people tell me oh, my uncle put a system in, or my friend put a system in, my neighbor has a system. So I know there are some happening. I haven't been able to, take the time yet to really get to know the industry in Maine, but I'm looking forward to doing so. And I'm excited about someday, and I hope someday soon, we will be here.
So you mentioned rebates, and the Buildings Working Group did spend a lot of time thinking about other kinds of energy efficiency and air source heat pump rebates. So I know off the top of my head that Efficiency Maine right now is offering $3,000 rebates for geothermal installations. How does that compare with what's available in other states? You said other states have been sort of recalibrating those rebates. So I'm guessing there's some differences.
Yeah, there are. And I'm just wondering if I could share my screen again to show a slide that had a couple of those numbers. Let's see. Now I can't get it to go backwards. Okay, so can you see this? So yeah, the programs in New York, Connecticut, Vermont, and Massachusetts have all increased their rebates in the last few years to be on a per ton basis. So heat pumps are sold based on the amount of heating or cooling that they can provide. And heating and cooling tons are actually measured slightly differently, which is probably a level of detail that's not that important. Although interesting facts that I learned, because I like to understand, how measurements work. A ton of heating or cooling capacity is based on, for the cooling piece, the amount of heat required to melt a ton, 2,000 pounds of ice in 24 hours, which I thought was kind of cool. So like, I said that to a colleague the other day and they said like, well, when we install a 3-ton system, are we going to like show the homeowner it works by bringing 6,000 like tons of ice over and having them melted in their home, but anyway, so that is how a ton of cooling capacity is defined, and heating is sort of relative to that, slightly different. But the systems for your typical, between a 1,500 and 2,500 square foot home are usually going to be between 3 and 5 tons. And so you buy the equipment as I'm buying a 4-ton heat pump or I'm buying a 6-ton heat pump. And so the rebate program, starting based off what happened in New York State, first with Con Ed as a utility, and then with the New York State wide program through what's called NYSERDA, one of their energy agencies there, was on a per ton basis. And so still in New York State, it's between $1,500 or $2,000 per ton. So you can imagine between, $6,000 and $10,000 that you as the homeowner would have as a rebate. Energized Connecticut is $1,500 a ton if you're coming off of heating oil, propane, or electric resistance, but only $750 a ton if you're coming off of gas. And that had to do with their calculation of energy efficiency relative to gas. Efficiency Vermont is $2,100 per ton. Massachusetts was $2,000 per ton, but they actually just switched as of January 1st to a $15,000 set rebate for whole home, which means that if you're in a smaller home, you're getting a better value per ton. And if you're in a larger home, like some very large homes are putting in, 8 or 10 tons of heat pumps, like 2 sometimes, and many multiple geothermal holes, like 2 or 3, then their rebate amount is limited. And so the Massachusetts program was set up to be progressive in that way.
But in all of those, we're talking about a lot more support for installing geothermal in other states than we're seeing currently in Maine.
Yes.
Okay. Anything that you're aware of that's in in development to change that or to increase those incentives in Maine?
No, I don't know. No, I think there's a couple of issues. One is that in all of these other states that I've talked about, with the exception of Vermont, there are a lot of gas customers and there are gas utilities, and the gas utilities have to pay into efficiency programs just like the electric utilities do. And so you've got more money to work with in the efficiency programs to be able to spread across all of the technologies. In Maine, we really only have the electric utility that has efficiency charges we all pay as ratepayers, and then those are what pay for our rebates for air source heat pumps or insulation or whatever else we do as improvements. But part of the issue is that those electric, rates are then subsidizing heating efficiency improvements. And the reason that we don't have a contribution from the utility on the heating side is because we don't have a system for heating oil companies to be paying into the efficiency. And I think creating that would be fraught politically, right? Putting an extra, what would be interpreted as a tax on heating oil.
There have been proposals, though. There have been proposals to create that.
Maybe you can get something passed, Kathleen. That would be.
We'll keep everybody up to date. So I know there are a million different elements that go into designing and therefore into pricing these systems, but is there a ballpark number that's useful at all for homeowners to have of, what does it take to invest in home geothermal?
Absolutely. And I do, I think part of how I've started talking about it is that it's similar to a car. Like you can't really ask someone like, how much does a car cost? Right? Because it really depends on whether you're buying like, a little teeny hatchback or a giant, SUV or truck. So similar to just like homes vary in size, and homes also vary in insulation. And so you could have the same size square footage of a home, but if it's a single story versus 2 stories, or if it's well insulated versus barely insulated, then you're going to need a different size system. So all of that said, the cost for a system is actually vary pretty similarly to cars, and also vary depending on where you are geographically. So it is cheaper for us to install in more rural areas of New York than in the very tight suburbs of New York, and that has to do with the logistics and the permitting of what it takes to actually install systems in like New York suburbs. So the prices do vary regionally as well. But basically you're looking at in like a total full price, somewhere between, I would say, 30,000 to 50,000 for the system itself, all in, with the drilling and the install and the HVAC heat pump system. So if you have a rebate of, around between 7,000 and 15,000 that you're taking off the top of that. So say you have a $40,000 system and you have a $10,000 rebate, then you're down to 30,000. We have a 26% federal investment tax credit right now. So you're taking, a little bit more than a quarter then off of that 30%. So what we're trying to do with customers with rebates and with sizing their systems and recommending insulation before they do the heat pump so that they can minimize the heat pump size, then we're usually trying to get down to around $20,000 in the cost after rebate and tax credit. Then they're looking at, usually they're coming to us because they know they're close to end of life on their current boiler or furnace. And at some point during the 25 years of the system, also potentially replacing an air conditioning system or not putting in a central air conditioning system, because this will serve that purpose. And so once you sort of subtract off the extra, 5 to 12,000 that it's going to cost them to do those 2 systems, then you can look at financing a system and having it actually end up cheaper than what they're spending on their current fuel and air conditioning.
Because of course, once you've made that investment, you don't have an oil bill or a gas bill to pay every month, right?
That's right.
Okay. There are so many more questions that we are not going to have time to get to, but there's one that I think is a great way to close out our hour together. What's your background and why are you doing this work?
So I am doing this work because I actually come from a background in marine science and marine policy and community development. So I'm trained as an ocean physics PhD by training many years ago, and worked in Maine for a long time at the Island Institute, an organization that some people may know, doing community development work with island and remote coastal communities. And I just really got fed up over time with how depressing it was to spend so much time and effort working with people who were dealing with the impacts of climate change on their fisheries, on their, main streets that were being flooded all of the time, on dealing with acidification of our clam flats in Maine. It was just very upsetting and frustrating. And I really wanted to be working on a solution. I really wanted to get up every day working on the clean energy side. So I transitioned into working as a consultant, did some work on offshore wind energy, worked for Revision Energy for a while on solar, which was fantastic. And then I had been following Dandelion for a few years because I just thought that their origin story was so cool and the technology is so important. So when this job opened up this summer, I was just absolutely thrilled. And I've just been so glad to be on board with them and really excited. And I do hope we will be in Maine very soon.
Thank you so much for working on these climate solutions and for bringing so many of us up to speed. As you said earlier, there are a lot of folks out there who just don't know the first thing about geothermal. So thanks for arming all of us with the information to go out there and spread the word. We are grateful to you for joining us today. Grateful for everybody who was with us. I hope that you'll all join us next week. We will be back in this space for a conversation about the spiritual roots of the climate crisis and the work that the BTS Center in Portland is doing to advance a spiritual response. this actually is a nice transition from what you were just saying, Heather, about the stress of looking at the impacts all the time and how do we take care of ourselves so that we can keep advancing the solutions as well. Alan Ewing Merrill is the executive director of the BTS Center, and he will be with us next week for spiritual leadership in a climate changed world. Hope to see you then. And until then, have a wonderful weekend, everybody. Thank you, Heather.
Thank you.